Today we're analyzing a Reddit story that shows exactly why relationship ultimatums are massive red flags. A 32-year-old man's girlfriend tried to manipulate him into marriage with a Valentine's Day deadline, and his response was calculated and brilliant. Let's dive in. She told me that if I didn't propose by Valentine's Day, she'd go back to her ex, and I said that was fair. And what happened next on Valentine's Day became the most surreal dinner of my entire life. My name is Daniel. I'm 32 years old, and I'm the kind of guy who never thought he'd be telling a breakup story on the internet. But here we are because this whole situation was so absurd that I still can't believe it actually happened. Let me back up and explain how I ended up in a situation where a woman I thought I loved tried to manipulate me into marriage using her wealthy ex-boyfriend as leverage, and how I made a decision that would change everything. This story starts about 2 years ago at my cousin's wedding in downtown Chicago, one of those massive events with 300 guests, an open bar, and a DJ who thought playing the Cupid Shuffle 3 times was acceptable. I was standing near the bar trying to avoid my aunt's questions about why I was still single when this absolutely stunning woman walked up next to me and ordered a vodka cranberry. Her name was Kimberly Palmer. She was 29, worked as a marketing executive for some tech startup, and she had this presence about her that made everyone in the room turn and look when she walked by. We started talking. She laughed at my terrible jokes about the wedding cake, and by the end of the night we were dancing to songs we both pretended to hate, and honestly it felt like something out of a romantic comedy. The first year with Kimberly was genuinely great because we traveled to Nashville, Miami, and even flew out to Portland for a long weekend. We'd stay up late talking about everything from philosophy to our favorite childhood cartoons, and the physical chemistry was off the charts. She had this apartment in Lincoln Park with huge windows overlooking the city, and I had my place in Wicker Park, so we didn't live together, but we were together almost every single night. Her friends loved me, my friends thought she was gorgeous and fun, and my mom kept dropping hints about grandchildren every time we had Sunday dinner. Everything seemed perfect, or at least that's what I kept telling myself even when the red flags started appearing around the 1-year mark. Now here's a question I should have asked myself back then. Have you ever ignored warning signs in a relationship because you were too invested to see them clearly? The marriage hints started small, and I almost didn't notice them at first because Kimberly would send me Instagram posts of engagement rings with captions like "just browsing," or she'd point out couples getting engaged at restaurants with this look in her eyes that made me uncomfortable. Then her best friend got engaged, and suddenly every conversation became about weddings, and she started buying bridal magazines and leaving them on my coffee table when she stayed over, claiming it was just for fun. I told myself this was normal because we'd been together over a year and she was 29, so obviously marriage was on her mind. But it started to feel less like natural relationship progression and more like a calculated campaign. The hints turned into direct conversations where she'd ask when I thought people should get engaged, what kind of wedding I'd want, how many kids I saw myself having, and every time I tried to pump the brakes or say I wasn't ready to think about that yet, her mood would completely shift. She'd go from laughing and happy to cold and distant in about 5 seconds. Sometimes she'd tear up and say I didn't take our relationship seriously. Other times she'd just go silent and leave my apartment without saying goodbye. The crazy part was that the next day she'd act like nothing had happened. She'd text me good morning with heart emojis and suggest we grab dinner like we hadn't just had a massive fight the night before. I started to realize that Kimberly had this pattern of emotional instability where she'd blow up over something, make me feel like the bad guy, then reset everything and expect me to just move on without ever actually resolving the issue. Her ex-boyfriend Michael started coming up in conversations more frequently around month 15, and at first I thought she was just being honest about her past, but then I noticed she only mentioned him when we were fighting about commitment. She'd say things like Michael wanted to marry me or Michael would have proposed by now, and I'd just sit there thinking about how weird it was that she kept comparing me to a guy she supposedly didn't want anymore. I did some light social media stalking because I'm only human, and I found out that Michael was this successful real estate developer who drove a BMW, wore expensive suits in all his photos, and apparently still followed Kimberly on Instagram and liked most of her posts. The whole thing gave me this sick feeling in my stomach because it seemed less like she was over him and more like she was keeping him as a backup plan in case I didn't work out. Around month 18, things got worse because Kimberly started making wedding venue visits, and she'd come back and tell me about this beautiful barn in Wisconsin or this elegant ballroom downtown, and I felt like I was being pulled into a current I couldn't escape. I tried to have an honest conversation with her one night at her apartment where I said, "I care about you, but I'm not ready to think about marriage yet," and she completely lost it. She started crying and yelling that I was wasting her time, that she could be with someone who actually valued her, that her biological clock was ticking, and I was being selfish by not committing. I remember sitting on her couch feeling like I was the villain in a movie I didn't audition for. And when I tried to defend myself, she just cried harder and said I didn't understand what it was like to be a woman approaching 30. The next morning, she texted me, "I'm sorry, I love you," and suggested we go to brunch like the whole fight never happened. And that's when I started to understand that this pattern was never going to change unless something drastic happened. But I loved her, or at least I thought I did. So I kept going along with it and hoping things would somehow get better on their own, which looking back was incredibly stupid of me. Then came the night that changed everything. And honestly, I should have seen it coming because Qley had been extra sweet all week, cooking dinner at my place, being affectionate, not mentioning marriage once, and I actually thought maybe we turned a corner. It was a cold night in January. We were sitting at my dining table eating spaghetti that she'd made, and everything felt comfortable and normal. And then she looked at me with this completely calm expression and said, "I need to tell you something important." And my stomach immediately dropped because I knew whatever was coming wasn't good. Notice the emotional reset pattern here. Qley creates conflict, makes Daniel feel guilty, then acts like nothing happened the next day. This trains people to accept manipulation without resolution. The constant comparisons to her ex Michael weren't honesty. They were designed to create insecurity and competition. Qley put down her fork, looked me straight in the eyes with this eerily calm expression, and said, "If you don't propose to me by Valentine's Day, I'm going back to Michael." And the whole room just went silent except for the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. I sat there frozen for a moment trying to process what she'd just said because this wasn't a conversation or a discussion. This was an ultimatum delivered like she was negotiating a business deal. And the crazy part was how casual she sounded about it, like she was telling me what she wanted for breakfast. She explained that Michael had been texting her recently, that he'd told her breaking up was the biggest mistake of his life, that he was ready to propose whenever she wanted. And she said all of this while looking at me like she expected me to panic and immediately pull out a ring. I could see in her face that she thought this was a brilliant strategy, that threatening to leave me for her rich ex-boyfriend would make me realize what I was about to lose and force me to commit. But instead, something completely different happened inside my brain. I looked at her sitting there so confident and satisfied with herself, and I felt this wave of clarity wash over me that was so intense it almost felt physical. And I realized that this woman didn't love me. She was trying to trade me like a stock that wasn't performing well enough. The thought that kept running through my mind was that if someone really loves you, they don't threaten to leave you for someone else unless you marry them. They don't use another person as leverage to manipulate you into the biggest decision of your life. And they definitely don't set arbitrary deadlines like you're some kind of work project that needs to be completed by a certain date. I took a deep breath and said, "That's fair." And I watched her face light up with this triumphant smile because she thought she'd won. She thought I was agreeing to her terms and that a proposal was now inevitable. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand and started talking about how she knew I'd understand, how we were going to be so happy together, how Valentine's Day would be perfect for an engagement, and I just sat there nodding while my brain was already 3 steps ahead planning something completely different. The rest of dinner was surreal because she was chattering away about wedding ideas and honeymoon destinations while I was having this intense internal conversation with myself about what I was actually going to do. Here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever had a moment where you suddenly saw a situation with perfect clarity, where all the confusion just evaporated and you knew exactly what you had to do? I wasn't thinking about buying a ring or planning a proposal. I was thinking about the fact that I'd just been given an ultimatum by someone who claimed to love me, and how fundamentally messed up that was on every possible level. The phrase that kept repeating in my head was that I wasn't being chosen, I was being forced, and once I thought that, I couldn't unthink it because it was so obviously true. Qley didn't want to marry me specifically. She wanted to get married before she turned 30, and I was the guy who happened to be there. And if I didn't comply, she had Michael waiting in the wings like an understudy ready to take my place. I realized that if I proposed under these conditions, I'd be walking into a marriage that started with blackmail, and that would set the tone for the rest of my life because she'd know that threatening to leave me was an effective tool to get whatever she wanted. That night after I drove home, I sat in my living room until 3 in the morning just thinking through every possible outcome, and I came to the conclusion that I had to end this relationship, but I had to do it in a way that was clean and final. I knew Qley well enough to know that if I just broke up with her over text or at one of our apartments, she'd cry and manipulate and promise to change, and I'd probably cave, because I'm not great with emotional confrontation. I needed to do it in a public place where she couldn't make a huge scene, somewhere neutral where I could say what I needed to say and then leave. And that's when the idea hit me. Valentine's Day was 3 weeks away, and Qley was expecting a proposal at a nice restaurant. So why not give her the nice restaurant and the public setting, just not the outcome she was anticipating? The more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed because she'd be so focused on getting engaged that she wouldn't see the breakup coming. And by the time she realized what was happening, it would already be done. Over the next 3 weeks, Qley was the happiest I'd ever seen her because she genuinely believed she'd manipulated me into proposing, and watching her walk around in this delusional bubble of confidence was almost sad. She got her nails done in this specific shade of pink that she said would photograph well with a ring, and she kept leaving little notes around my apartment with her ring size written on them like I might forget. She told all her friends that something big was happening on Valentine's Day. She bought a new red dress that cost probably $400. And she even made a hair appointment at some fancy salon downtown for the morning of. Meanwhile, I was systematically removing myself from her life in ways she didn't notice because she was too focused on her fantasy engagement. I took all my stuff out of her apartment over the course of 2 weeks, just a few items each time I visited so she wouldn't get suspicious, and I changed my Netflix password, my Amazon password, and made sure my name wasn't on anything of hers that could cause problems later. I called my buddy Jason, who's a lawyer, and asked him hypothetically if there was anything I needed to worry about legally when breaking up with someone. And he told me as long as we didn't live together and didn't have any shared assets, I was fine, which was a relief. The hardest part was booking the restaurant because I wanted somewhere nice enough that she'd believe a proposal was happening, but not so expensive that I'd regret spending the money when I broke up with her instead. I settled on this Italian place called Marcello's in River North that had white tablecloths and dim lighting and was known for romantic dinners. And when I made the reservation, the host asked if we were celebrating anything special, and I said something like that, which felt darkly funny. I also told my brother what I was planning because I needed someone to know in case Qley tried to spin some crazy story afterward. And he thought I was insane, but also said if I was going to do it, at least make it memorable, which I guess I took to heart. The week before Valentine's Day, Qley started acting extra sweet and affectionate, probably because she wanted to make sure I was still on board with proposing. And she kept saying things like she couldn't wait for our special day with this knowing smile that made my skin crawl. She had no idea that I'd already mentally ended the relationship and was just waiting for the right moment to make it official. And there was something almost peaceful about having made the decision because all the anxiety and pressure just evaporated. Valentine's Day finally arrived, and Qley texted me early in the morning saying, "Today is going to be perfect," with about 15 heart emojis, and I just responded with a simple "see you tonight," because I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want to tip her off. She spent the entire day getting ready. She went to the spa, got her hair done in these elaborate curls, put on the red dress and these expensive heels, and when I picked her up at 6:30, she looked absolutely stunning and completely convinced that she was about to get engaged. The drive to the restaurant was torture because she kept talking about how romantic the night was going to be, how she'd always remember this day, how grateful she was that I'd finally come around to her timeline, and I just gripped the steering wheel and focused on the road. We pulled up to Marcello's. The valet took my car, and as we walked toward the entrance, Qley grabbed my arm and whispered, "This is perfect." And I thought to myself that she was right. It really was perfect, just not in the way she imagined. Daniel's 3-week preparation wasn't cruelty. It was survival strategy. He knew from experience that private conversations with Qley ended in manipulation. So he chose a public setting where she couldn't use emotional tactics to guilt him into staying. The hostess led us to a corner table that was probably the most romantic spot in the entire restaurant, with candles flickering and a perfect view of the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. And Qley was practically glowing with anticipation as she sat down and smoothed out her red dress. She kept looking at me with these expectant eyes like she was waiting for me to drop to one knee right there before we even ordered drinks, and I could see her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the menu and pretended to read it even though I knew she wasn't processing a single word. The waiter came over and took our drink orders. Qley got champagne because of course she did, and I ordered a beer because I needed something to keep me grounded in reality while this whole surreal situation played out. When the waiter left, she reached across the table and put her hand on mine and started talking about how she'd been thinking about this moment for so long, how she knew we were meant to be together, how Valentine's Day was always her favorite holiday, and I just nodded along while mentally rehearsing what I was going to say. The appetizers came out about 15 minutes later, some kind of fancy bruschetta that Kimberly barely touched because she was too nervous and excited, and I ate mine slowly because I knew that once these plates were cleared, everything was about to change. I waited until the waiter took away our appetizer plates and promised the main courses would be out in about 10 minutes. And that's when I made my move because the timing needed to be perfect. I reached across the table and took both of Kimberly's hands in mine, and her eyes immediately filled with tears of joy because she thought this was it. This was the moment she'd been manipulating me toward for months. She was already starting to smile, that huge engaged girl smile that I'd seen on Instagram 1,000 times, and I took a deep breath and said, "Kimberly, I need to tell you something important." And she nodded enthusiastically like, "Yes, yes, say it, ask me." I looked her right in the eyes and said, "I don't want to marry you. I never want to marry you. And this relationship is over." And I watched her face go through about 5 different emotions in the span of 2 seconds. First, there was confusion, like she didn't understand the words I'd just said. Then there was shock as the meaning started to sink in. Then disbelief, like surely this was some kind of joke. Then anger as she realized I was completely serious. And finally, this raw devastation that almost made me feel bad, except I remembered why I was doing this in the first place. She pulled her hands away from mine like I'd burned her and just stared at me with her mouth open. And for maybe 10 seconds, she didn't say anything at all, which was the longest I'd ever seen Kimberly go without talking. Then the questions started pouring out in this frantic stream, asking what I meant, asking if this was because of the ultimatum, asking if there was someone else, and I calmly explained that you don't threaten someone with their replacement if you actually love them. I told her that the moment she gave me that ultimatum about Michael, she'd shown me exactly what I was worth to her, and that worth was conditional and came with a deadline like a business contract. I said that marriage should come from love and mutual choice, not from blackmail and manipulation, and that I refused to start a life with someone who'd already proven they'd use emotional pressure to get what they wanted. Kimberly's face went from pale to bright red, and she started getting loud, not quite yelling, but definitely loud enough that the couple at the next table glanced over with concern. She said I'd wasted her time, that I'd led her on, that I'd promised her a future, and I just sat there thinking about how none of that was actually true because I'd never promised anything except to be honest about my feelings. She accused me of planning this whole thing just to humiliate her. And honestly, she wasn't completely wrong about that, because I definitely could have broken up with her at her apartment or somewhere private. But I also knew that doing it publicly meant she couldn't guilt me into staying or manipulate me with tears in the privacy of one of our homes. The waiter approached our table looking uncomfortable because he could obviously tell something was wrong, and he asked if everything was okay. And I said we were fine and asked if he could bring out any dessert that might have been ordered ahead of time. Kimberly looked at me with this confused expression because she had no idea what I was talking about. But I had a strong suspicion based on how confident she'd been that something special was waiting in the kitchen. The waiter nodded slowly and disappeared back toward the kitchen, looking relieved to escape the tension. And Kimberly stood up from the table and said, You're going to regret this," with this venom in her voice that I'd never heard before. She grabbed her purse, and I could see her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. And I assumed she was calling an Uber, because there was no way she'd sit through dessert with me now. But here's the thing, and this is a question worth considering. Have you ever made a decision that felt ruthless in the moment, but absolutely necessary for your future? She stood there next to the table for what felt like an eternity, probably waiting for her ride to show up, and neither of us said a word because there was nothing left to say. Then the waiter came back out carrying a small plate with what looked like a custom chocolate dessert, and as he got closer I could see words written across the top in elegant white frosting. He set it down on the table, and the words "Say Yes" were staring up at both of us, and the whole situation became so absurd that I almost started laughing. Kimberly had apparently pre-ordered this dessert weeks ago, probably right after she gave me the ultimatum, assuming that I'd proposed during dinner and that this dessert would be the perfect moment to celebrate our engagement. The waiter stood there looking deeply confused about why a couple who was clearly breaking up had an engagement dessert, and Kimberly's face went from angry to completely mortified as she realized what had just happened. I looked at the dessert, then at her, and said that's really something, and I could see her trying to decide whether to run out of the restaurant immediately or stay and try to salvage some dignity. She chose to leave. She turned and walked as fast as she could in those expensive heels toward the exit, and I sat there alone at the table with his "Say Yes" dessert and the attention of half the restaurant on me. The waiter came back after a moment and asked if I still wanted the check, and I said yes and apologized for the scene, and he actually laughed and said he'd seen much worse breakups during his years at Marcello's, which made me feel slightly better. The bill came out to $147, which felt like a small price to pay for my freedom, and I left a $40 tip because that waiter had definitely earned it dealing with our drama. I drove home in complete silence. No music, no phone calls, just me and my thoughts processing what had just happened. And when I got back to my apartment, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief, like I'd just escaped something terrible. Kimberly started texting me around 10 that night, first with angry messages about how I'd humiliated her in public, then with sad messages about how we could work things out if I'd just listen, then with threatening messages about how I'd ruined her life, and everyone would know what kind of person I really was. I read the first 10 messages just to make sure there wasn't anything urgent, and then I blocked her number because I was done engaging with the drama and manipulation. I found out later through a mutual friend that Kimberly had told everyone I cheated on her, which wasn't true, but most of our mutual friends could see through her version of events because they'd witnessed her behavior patterns over the years. That same friend told me that Kimberly had gone back to Michael within a week of our breakup, which honestly just proved my point about her having a backup plan all along. She didn't need time to grieve or process. She just moved laterally to her next option like I predicted. The aftermath was quieter than I expected because I'd braced myself for more drama, but apparently Kimberly was too busy with Michael to keep focusing on me. My life slowly returned to normal over the next few months. I started going out with friends again without worrying about her reactions. I focused on my work, and I even went on a few casual dates, though nothing serious. About 6 months later, that same mutual friend reached out and told me something that made the whole experience feel almost poetic. Apparently, Kimberly had pulled the exact same ultimatum move on Michael. She'd given him a deadline to propose or she'd leave, probably using me or some other guy as the threat this time. And here's the kicker. Michael broke up with her too because nobody wants to be manipulated into marriage, regardless of how much they might care about someone. I never reached out to Kimberly again, and I never regretted my decision. And looking back, the only thing I regret is not ending it sooner when the red flags first started appearing around that 1-year mark. The whole experience taught me something valuable about relationships and self-respect that I wish I'd understood earlier. Someone who truly loves you will never force you to prove it on their timeline with their conditions, and they definitely won't threaten to replace you if you don't comply with their demands. Walking away from manipulation is always the right choice, even when it's hard, even when you're invested, even when everyone around you thinks you should just go along with it to keep the peace. There's a difference between compromise in a relationship and surrendering your agency. And I'd crossed that line so many times with Kimberly that I'd almost forgotten what healthy boundaries looked like. That Valentine's Day dinner cost me $147 in a 2-year relationship, but it bought me something infinitely more valuable. It bought me back my self-respect and my freedom to choose a partner who wants to build a life with me, not someone who wants to force me into one. There's only one thing more expensive than leaving a toxic relationship, and that's staying in one and paying for it with years of your life that you'll never get back. And I'm grateful every day that I chose the cheaper option. The key lesson here is that ultimatums reveal someone's true intentions. When Kimberly pulled the same move on Michael and he also left, it proved this was never about Daniel specifically. It was her pattern of using threats to force commitment. If you're feeling manipulated rather than loved in your relationship, that's your answer. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.